Hello everyone, I hope you've had a good couple of weeks. Sorry I missed the video last week. We went to Tennessee to see the kids and my sister, and we had a great trip, but if I had been prepared I would have done 2 videos in advance, but I wasn't and I didn't, so I apologize for that. Hopefully in 2 weeks not everything fell out of your brain from Hebrews and you'll be able to make the connection really quick. With this video, I'm looking forward to studying chapters 9 and 10, which is where we're at today, and sort of wrapping up what we've called the doctrinal section of Hebrews. Not that there's no doctrine in the last few chapters, but the heavy arguments that the writer has been giving. So, what we've seen so far is that Christ is better than prophets, angels, creation, Moses. He's a better high priest. We talked about, there's a little pause about the need to grow. I should have put in there too about the need to stay faithful and not fail to enter your rest in chapter 4. And the mediator of a better covenant with better promises, which the writer talked about a lot in chapter 8. In fact, he left chapter 8 with these words. In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. So, let's talk about chapter 9 and 10 through 10:17, or 10:18. A better sanctuary, sacrifice, priesthood, and covenant. Okay, in my intro here, I have just copied down what's in the book. If you have the book, I don't know if you've been following along in the book that I've written that goes with this, but I've just copied down that basically I'm reading my intro from the book, because I spent a lot of time thinking about the intro, obviously, since I wrote it in a book, and I don't think I can introduce this section any better way than the thought I put into it before. So, but before I introduce it, let's read the text and get your mind fixed. I want you to look at that chart for a couple of minutes, but 10 or 20 seconds. Think about it. Burn it in your brain. If you've studied the Bible a lot and studied the Old Testament, you've seen a lot of different renditions or pictures. Maybe you started out with flannel graph tabernacle. Maybe when you were a kid you made models of tabernacles in Bible study. It took me decades to realize how important that structure was. As I thought about Hebrews through the years, I've come to realize that probably the most important compound, enclosure, place, of course the temple later, probably the most important place on earth, maybe besides Calvary, of course, for reasons that we're going to talk about tonight. But so you're looking at that and getting it burned in on your brain, and you'll understand why I want you to do that, because as we read the text, this is what we're talking about. Chapter 9, verse 1, we're just going to read through verse 11 right now and talk about this first section. Now, even the first covenant had divine regulations for worship and an earthly place of holiness. Actually, not divine regulations. I've misread the ESV. I've read it so many times in the NASB. Now, even the first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly place of holiness. For a tent was prepared, and the first section, in which were the lampstand and the table and the bread of the presence. It is called the holy place. You can see it there on the chart. Verse 3. Behind the second curtain was a second section called the most holy place, having the golden altar of incense and the ark of the covenant covered on all sides with gold, in which was a golden urn holding the manna, and Aaron's staff that budded, and the tables of the covenant. Above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail. I'm going to say something real quick there, and I think I'm going to say it later. So people have taken all these elements and tried to make New Testament things out of them, which the writer does not do. And he specifically says, I'm not going to take the time to go into these things in detail. And the main reason is because they're not these individual elements, the golden urn, the staff that budded, the tablets, they're not germane to the big idea he's trying to present in Hebrews. Verse 6, these preparations having thus been made, the priests go regularly into the first section, performing their ritual duties. But into the second, only the high priest goes, and he but once a year, and not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the unintentional sins of the people. But by this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the holy places is not yet opened as long as the first section is still standing, which is symbolic for the present age. According to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but deal only with food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until the time of Reformation. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, notice he says not the good things to come, but have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is not of the creation. Then he goes on to talk about how Christ entered the holy place once for all. So, let's talk about the first section of chapter 9. The first covenant, that is obsolete, 8:13, had regulations or laws of worship, or for worship. The writer is setting up his argument by reminding me, by the way, the debacle of 2 weeks ago where it was split into two videos, I'm not going to let that happen again. I think my camera, as long as I can stay under 45 minutes, which is plenty time anyway, it'll stay on one video, and I'm sorry about that weirdness 2 weeks ago. Anyway, the writer is setting up his argument by reminding the readers of the Old Testament system of sacrifice and worship to learn more about those divine regulations. Read, I should have read, I don't know why I period. Read, and I suggested this in my post on Facebook. We're not going to go back and read all of that. I'm going to assume that you've read the Old Testament enough. If you haven't, it just would take too much time for us to read all that ourselves. You know, he wouldn't call it those two sections of Scripture, Exodus 25 through 31, Leviticus 1 through 17. You wouldn't call those things riveting reading. Not like the stories of Joseph and the great narratives and the very fascinating things that happen throughout the Bible. There are laws and rules and regulations, do this, don't do that. But they are very meaningful because, we'll talk about that as we go on. Note that 9:1 is referring to 8:13, where the writer says the old covenant is becoming obsolete, growing old, and ready to vanish. And I've said this many times, the trouble with chopping a book up, and we have to do this in 45-minute segments, is the trouble of keeping continuity throughout the whole flow of the text. So he's talking about the new covenant in chapter 8, and again he ended chapter 8 by saying the old covenant is obsolete, growing old, ready to vanish away. He's going to explain the relationship of the old covenant to the new and help us understand why the old covenant was going away to make way for the new. He will do this by comparing the inadequacy of the old regulations compared to the new. So he really makes this great argument in chapter 8 that the old covenant's going away, and now he's going to talk about the old covenant and what it did and didn't accomplish, and how specifically, what are those elements that the new covenant perfects or makes right. As the writer has mentioned before, 8:2 through 5, the Old Testament system of worship was a symbol or type of true worship and sacrifice. The focus of the symbol or type is the tabernacle. Very important point here. So that's why I led with that chart or that picture, artist rendition of the tabernacle. as he describes, as he explains the Old Covenant in 9 and 10 through 17, or 10 through 18, he's really focusing you in on what happened in that enclosure in the tabernacle and what was significant about that, the elements of worship there and what exactly happened there. Who was there? Who wasn't there? So the tabernacle is the focus of this discussion and what went on there. The word symbol is a Greek word for parabole, or we get the word parable. This word literally means a placing of one thing beside another, or juxtaposition of ships in battle. Ships they're organized in battle, put next to each other for a specific purpose. The earthly tabernacle is placed beside the true tabernacle as a comparison. The Old Testament elements of worship were regulations imposed until a time of Reformation. So that's verse 10. Verse 10. The Greek word for Reformation, diorthosios, say that fast 3 times. I don't speak Greek fluently. Just know enough to get, the old saying, to get myself in trouble. It means to straighten thoroughly, rectification. We understand orthopedics. It has to do with the idea of straightening the bones. This word, back to this, sorry. This word reformation is this idea of straightening. This word can be contrasted to the word complete or perfect in Hebrews. So we see the Old Testament regulations as crooked in that they were incomplete and they weren't what the true original God has always intended to be. The Old Covenant worship, with its priesthood and sacrifice, was not like a bone that was once straight and then got broken. When you think of orthopedics, for instance, we had a straight bone, then we broke it, and we went and got it fixed. The thing is, the Old Testament regulations were never straight or perfect. This is not because God tried something and failed. It's not because he tried it and he tried to make something and he got it crooked. It is because God designed the Old Testament worship to be an incomplete shadow. So there's all these adjectives and nouns used to describe the fact that shadow and copy and type and antitype and all these words to describe the nature of the old and the nature of the new. The old was in place until a time of reformation. Ortho, a straightening out. I'll reread that. It is because God designed the Old Testament worship to be an incomplete shadow of the true worship and system of sanctification that comes through Christ. The rest of chapters 9 and 10, really through 10:18, will elaborate on how the process of worship and sanctification has been straightened or perfected under the new covenant through the service that has been and is being offered in this true tabernacle. The elements of worship, or sacrifice, and the tabernacle are symbolic of elements of Jesus' ministry. In our examination of types, we learned that it may be possible to compare the new covenant elements to some old covenant elements described in 9:1 through 5, even though the text doesn't directly suggest them as types. Laver, baptism, showbread, the Lord's Supper, incense, good works. Actually, the writer does, later in Hebrews, talk about the sweet-smelling aroma. And this idea, incense is burned to create a sweet-smelling aroma. It was burned, and the smoke would go up, and where was God? He was up. So incense, the sweet-smelling aroma, an effort by man to send something pleasing to God. And the New Testament talks about the fruit of our lips being that incense or that sweet smelling aroma. But in general, I would say that the writer does not make all these comparisons. That's the I'll call them micro comparisons. And I can understand why. The Hebrew writer might have sort of, and maybe these are legitimate, maybe the laver, where the priest would wash himself before going in, maybe that is a type of baptism, although the scriptures do not say that. But the Hebrew writer doesn't want to get into all that. And he says we go into more details about this stuff, but I don't want to, because he doesn't want us to miss. There are comparisons that really, really matter, and he's going to emphasize those. So so why does he even bring up all this stuff in 1 through, particularly 1 through 5? And so the altar of incense, the Ark of the Covenant, the golden urn. I think he's mostly trying to, like I tried to do with that picture at the very beginning, he's trying to get them to throw their minds back, and to absorb what was going on in that enclosure and the mechanisms, and we'll explain why a little bit later, so that they can really visually compare that spiritually to what is in place today. The specific items of Old Covenant worship the text focuses on in the New Covenant worship are. So these are the things that the writer, says, again, he says, golden urn, these things I don't want to talk about, but here's what he does talk about. The outer and the inner portions of the tabernacle. He's going to explain that. The holy place and the Holy of Holies, the veil that has separated the two, and the sacrifices and the priests. So, going back to the thing that I've been beating you over the head with, this is about access to God. So, I wish I had put another, I don't want to flip back and try to, maybe I will. I have to refine that wasn't too bad. As we look at that picture, the thing coming up from the Ark of the Covenant, the wooey cloud, cloud and fire pillar of fire, the presence of God. This is a cutaway kind of a thing. But if you imagine that covered with a heavy curtain and not the cutaway like in the picture, and the presence of God above that, and everybody knew that Ark of the Covenant was in that back room, nobody ever got to go in there. And I know I've emphasized this before, but this is the emphasis of the book. In a sense, it's the emphasis of the Bible. It's not an exaggeration. Adam and Eve were in the presence they were in the Garden of Eden in communion with God, and they got booted out, and they couldn't get back in. And so this is, I think there's a very real sense in which this is a sort of a duplicate. That's where God is. And people know that he's there. If you're in one of those tents, you know that that's where the presence of God is. And they can see sort of a manifestation of him in the cloud and the pillar. But they were clear that and we've talked already about the mercy seat and what that was, and the Ark of the Covenant and his presence there. They could not get in. And that's what Hebrews 9 and the writer is trying to explain. He's trying to get them to in their minds, look at this picture. That's why I think he mentioned those individual items to get them, because they didn't have PowerPoint, to look at these things and understand the notion that they couldn't get in. But access to God, fixing what was broken in the beginning. Okay, coming back. How fast I can get there. Okay. The elements of worship, sacrifice, and tabernacle are symbolic of elements of Jesus' ministry. In our example of types, we learned that it may be possible, let's skip that, I already talked about it. The specific items of Old Testament worship, I missed. Number 4. The inadequacy of the Old Testament sanctuary and its rites and implements was that it could not make the worship perfect and conscious. So in these next 2 or 3 slides, we are going to sort of present to you, as the author does in his eloquent words, the central idea of old, new, Christ, the Bible, what God had in mind. The problem with the Old Testament sacrifices, they could not make the conscience of the worshiper perfect. This harkens back to the original tragedy. Adam and Eve sinned, and you remember what happened. Remember what Satan said? Your eyes will be opened. You'll be wise like God. Well, there is a sense in which that's true. He was a liar, of course. He's called the father of lies. But there's a sense in which that was true. They understood. Paul's very good at explaining this in his letters, especially in the book of Romans. When sin came in, I became aware of when the law came in, when a description, this is right and this is wrong, came in, I became aware that that was wrong. And then as I sinned, my conscience was aroused. And so I thought this through. I don't have a total handle on it, of course. But when Adam and Eve sinned, they did become aware. But the thing that seems to have been awakened was their conscience. Yeah, I think we sometimes don't talk enough about this because it's kind of a hard thing to get a handle on. Your conscience. That part of you that I believe God's put in you that says this is wrong and this is right, and some kind of instinctual. So if I do the wrong thing, I feel guilty or badly about it. And so the Hebrew writer talks about this. The Old Testament sacrifices, the animal sacrifices, could not perfect the conscience. It couldn't clear the conscience. It was inadequate in doing that. And apparently the conscience has to be cleared in order for us to have communion with God. So that was the original tragedy. And that was the inadequacy of the old law. Look at we should just read those verses. 9, 8. By this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the holy places is not yet opened as long as the first section is still standing, which is symbolic for the present age. So, do you understand what he's saying there? The first, the holy places can't be opened because there was and we, again, if we go back to the chart and the way it looked, the Holy of Holies was one place, and then there were really kind of 2 levels outside of that. You had the holy place, so you had to pass through the holy place to get into the Holy of Holies. But to get into the holy place, you had to get into the courtyard, or the tabernacle enclosure. So there were 2 or 3 levels separating the people. The priests had 2 levels to go through. And once the high priest, so some priests went into the holy place, not the Holy of Holies. They were 1 level off, but only once a year was it passed through. But his point that's being made here is this, again, that's what verse 8 is all about. The holy places is not, the way into the holy places is not opened as long as the first section is still standing. So as long as there was that construct, they were being blocked from the presence of God. And he goes on to say that, which is symbolic for the present age. It's true today, isn't it? We do not have access to God without getting into the holy place. And if there's one thing that the writer has tried to tell you, we now have a way into the holy place. We have, and the way is, somebody has gone there for us. It's almost like somebody will lead us by the hand in. And of course, we know that somebody is Christ. From that time until Christ, there was no way to completely fix the problem of a guilty conscience. This was even true of the ongoing attempts in the earthly sanctuary by the Levitical priests who offered animal blood. But when Christ appeared as the high priest of good things, a perfect conscience to come through a greater and more, so we didn't read that verse. It kind of got stuck on verse 8 and 9. Verse 9, which is symbolic for the present age. According to this arrangement, and by the way, that's an interesting phrase too. Who arranged all that? God did. So God arranged the gifts and the sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but deal only with food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until the time of Reformation. So all of these elements, the incense and all these things, the golden urn and the rod that budded and the lamb that was slaughtered, these earthly things, they could not, and it's interesting that the writer uses that phraseology. He doesn't say could not cleanse you of your sins. He says could not perfect the conscience. And I've always found that interesting, that that's the way the writer chooses to put it. He can't clear up the guilt of our sin with animal sacrifices. Here is a great pivot point in the text. The rest of the text until 10:19, when the writer changes course, will be like closing arguments in a court trial, or like the final strokes of the brush on the writer's theological masterpiece. So, so from now on, from 9:11 to 10:18, is the final arguments in his big explanation of how Christ is better. He actually is going to talk a little bit more about it later in the book, but he does rather switch course and start talking about, so this is what Christ has done for you, now this is what you need to do and be. But so he's going to sum this up. So this idea of the Reformation and it goes back to the end of chapter 8. The old covenant is going away. These divine or these God regulations, and they were imperfect. They couldn't clear up the conscience of the worshiper. And so he's going to talk specifically about the specific inadequacies of the specific mechanisms that were in place to bring forgiveness. From 9:11 till 10:18, he's going to show you how Christ replaced these mechanisms. So let's talk about, so I want to spend the rest of our time talking about the word sanctuary. We began with the idea that tabernacle, this discussion is focused on what happened in the tabernacle, or the sanctuary. The English word sanctuary actually, let's read 9. Let's read 9:1-3 again. Now, even the first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly place of holiness, for a tent was prepared, or tabernacle. I think the word in the Greek is skena, and it can mean tent or tabernacle. For a tent was prepared, verse 2, the first section, in which were these different things, verse 2, the end of verse 2. It is called the holy place. Verse 3, behind the second curtain was the second section called the most holy place. So, I'm going to talk about this word sanctuary. So, holy place, most holy place. The English word sanctuary is found in 2 places in Hebrews in all the major versions except the ESV. So, this is why this I've switched. When I wrote my Hebrew book originally, I was still in the NASB, or really NASU, New American Standard Updated Version. And so they used the word in these verses I read in early 9, instead of using holy, they used the word sanctuary. But I'm in the ESV now. It is an important word, and the reason I feel like I need to explain it is because it causes confusion. And so we're going to have a big sort of explanation of all this. And I understand this is technical, and you may not like it, but I think it's important that you understand. And The key to understanding God's words is you have to understand the meanings of words, and so this is an attempt to help you understand a very important concept or word, biblical word. It is an important word. It's also a very good example of how translation from the original New Testament language to Greek, which is Greek, to the English has created some confusion or lack of understanding. Below is a list of Greek words and how they are translated in the King James Version and most English Bibles in the book of Hebrews, along with their Strong's definition. This list is a grouping of words with the same root, hoggy or hog, we'll look at that on the next slide. By the way, I haven't listed the words. They're in the book. I didn't want to, it was just too much stuff. But if you have the book, look in it, and you'll understand what I'm talking about. But the main idea is this word holy or sanctified, it has a root word. And it's just like the word, and we have many words in the English. We start, if you remember English Grammar 101, you start with the root word, and then you have tenses and mode and voice and adjective, verb, noun. So like the word real. So there's many forms of real, unreal, real, reality, realistic, really. So the root word, of course, would be real. Notice that all these words have the same root. Hoggy. So by now you've looked at this list, but I don't have them. The list of all the words in the New Testament, and maybe I should have put them in, but they're almost always translated holy. Most of them are translated holy, but some are translated sanctified. Here's the big thing I want to shout at you, if I can. There is no difference in the word holy and sanctified. It's two different English words used to describe the same Greek word. There's not a Greek word for the word holy and a different Greek word for the word sanctified. It's all the same word. So if through the years you've seen the word holy and you've distinguished it from the word sanctified, you've blown it. And it's not your fault, because that's the difficult thing about translating from another language. They are the same word. These words are used interchangeably in their various forms in the Hebrew text, but the reader must understand that they express this exact same original word. Here's how they are synonymous. So holy or sanctified. So if you're going to talk about somebody who's holy, so if somewhere you see the word holy and somewhere you see the word sanctified, it's the same original word. It's just that the translators have used two different English words. A saint, there's not a different word for saint than there is for holy one. It's the same word. Maybe I should have included all those different words, because it would have really shown you what I'm talking about. To make holy is to sanctify. Holiness is the same as sanctification. It's just two different words in their forms. Holy place, holy thing, sanctuary. This, by the way, this has a point. The word sanctuary that is found twice in the English translation is a form of the root that means holy. In fact, the original word that is translated sanctuary in 8.2 and 9.2, but it's not in the ESV. I'm reading from ESV, but in yours it probably is. 8.2, 8.1. Now the point of what we're saying is this: we have such a high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty of heaven, Christ of course, a minister in the, and most versions say, sanctuary. Kudos, congratulations to the ESV for translating that holy places. A minister in the holy places, the true tent. The holy places, the true tent. That the Lord has set up, not man. And then 9.2, for a tent was prepared, the first section, in which were the lampstand and the table and the bread of presence. It is called the hagios. I don't remember the exact form. It might be hagios, actually, because the holy place, or the sanctuary. It's the same. It's exactly the same thing. and it's talked about in other places in Hebrews. So what's the point of all that? It's holy because it has to do with the presence of God. God is holy. Throughout the Old Testament, especially in the Pentateuch, I am holy, and if you're going to come near to me, you will treat me as holy, and you will be holy yourself. Where does God dwell? Wherever he dwells, it is going to be what? A holy place. So why is the room, the inner room, or the Ark of the Covenant, what's it called? The Sanctified of Sanctifieds. Exact same thing. Holy of Holies. Because, and it has to be called that because it has to be that, and so it's called that. By the way, it's also called the Tent of Meeting, but it's called that because it's where God is, and he is holy. The word sanctuary, the reason translators choose different English words to express the same Greek word is to create a proper impression, in their opinion, in the context of what is being spoken about. In 8.2 and 9.1, the translators apparently thought it would give the reader a more accurate understanding of the English words in those two references were not, if those two references were not holy place, which is the way the word is translated elsewhere in Hebrew. So, I'll keep going. In 8.2 and 9.1, the translators apparently the word sanctuary is more generic, church buildings or wildlife sanctuaries. And so here's what I mean about all that. When I say holy place, or holy of holies, you think of a specific, very specific thing, and that's that tent. That's that tent enclosure. If we weren't having this discussion at all, and we were in church or Bible study or Bible class one day, and I said the holy place, and what you would think of is a very specific place, not a place, but a very specific place. So the point that we're making here is the translators didn't want to specifically refer to that tent where those divine items of worship were, but rather the idea of a generic place that is holy. But my problem is they shouldn't do that because it's the same word. The word sanctuary is more generic. Church buildings are wildlife sanctuaries, whereas holy place is more focused in its meaning. While sanctuary is an acceptable translation, especially if the reader knows it means the same as holy place, why not be consistent and just say holy place? It's certain that the Hebrew writer did not have two different words in mind, and choosing a different word erases an important play on words that the writer is making. So this is kind of the punchline of all of this. The problem with the translation discretion is that it can disconnect the reader from an important nuance. This brings us to our final point in this discussion of translation. The text should read, "A minister in the holy place and the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched, not man." Note the Greek word for holy place is plural. The plural form usually referred to the Holy of Holies, which is an idea consistent with the point being made by the writer, which is what? Where is God? Where does he dwell? He dwells in the holy place. So a minister in the holy places, and the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched, not man. And so 9.1, now even the first covenant had regulations of divine worship. That's the old translation that I put in originally in the NASB. And the earthly holy place. So, and then note the Greek word here is a singular and refers to the whole tent or tabernacle, which again is consistent with the point. The writer is having a broad discussion about tabernacle worship. So I said all that to say, if you were a Hebrew reading this text, you would understand all the nuances, but they've sort of muddied the water by their inconsistent translations. So why does he use the word in 9.1 in the singular? He's not talking about the one little room that the Holy of Holies that the Ark of the Covenant was in, but the bigger, and what he listed what was all in there, and all these other things, the candlestick and the urn and the incense and all that stuff. So he listed that. So he's talking about this bigger enclosure. It's important that the nuance is important, because he's trying to create this picture of levels. That there's this, and there's this, and there's this, and on the very inside, on the Holy of Holies, that's where the priest is trying to get into the presence of God. The Hebrew writers explain very well what hagios means spiritually and in an earthly sense. But the English reader, that's enough. To belabor the point. Just quickly, this slide. So it might seem very complicated, but you can figure all this stuff out yourself if you take the time to learn. Find somebody. You don't have to become a Greek scholar. Everybody with a high school education can learn to understand words at this level. You need to just find somebody to help you do that. Somebody that's had training. We began this discussion by saying sanctuary, holy place is important. The Holy of Holies, as well as the holy place, was that place where the high priest went to make the people holy or sanctified. God is holy, and he will only have a relationship with holy people or saints. As we have mentioned earlier, this idea sends us back to the beginning. Man was created perfect and had a perfect union with God. Man sinned and became unholy. He was severed from God. Your sins have hidden me. I've hidden my face from you. Your sins have separated you from your God. Since then, the plan of God, as seen in the Bible, I should have highlighted this sentence. The plan of God, as seen in the Bible, has been to provide a way to make sanctification, which is another word for holiness, or make man holy once again. So that's the point. And that's the point of all these things, this discussion. How do we get man, Adam and Eve, perfect? They sinned, they were unholy. How do we fix that and get them holy again? Holy, and so able to be in God's presence. We need a sacrifice. In the Old Testament, the holy place or sanctuary was where that attempt was made. Sacrifices were also made continually by the people and priests to appease God, but the Hebrew writer does not mention these. As we will examine the text, as we will examine next, the high priest was the one who performed the sanctification process. Priests performed the task on a smaller scale outside the tabernacle daily, and animal sacrifice was the model of sanctification. Jesus is the once-for-all time part of the process to completely make man holy or sanctified. He is the high priest who serves in the heavenly tabernacle, who offered himself as the ultimate and complete sacrifice. Through Christ, sanctification or holiness is possible. Finally, it is interesting in Hebrews that the writer did not use the word temple instead of tabernacle. The Hebrews of that day would have known the temple, and it wouldn't have been like it was in Solomon's time. The tent tabernacle had not been in use for centuries. Plus, the Greek word for temple is hieron, or hieron, depending on how you pronounce it, epsilon iota, which is a form of hieros, which means sacred or holy. The word for priest is hieros, from the same root word. Probably the writer exclusively speaks of tabernacle to make a deeper connection with the worship of Moses' time and the image of God's presence above the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle. Another thing that broke down when they had the temple, it was in Jerusalem, and they were all over the country, right? They were living all over the country. So going back to, I think that's the last one, right? So going back to this, phooey. Well, you can still see it. I don't think I can get back in now. Going back to this, so, this chart, this picture. So my last thing was, why did God use the tent structure and not the fixed permanent temple structure as his motif? Because all of that was set up with a purpose, and in its intact form in the Old Covenant, all the elements are there. It was broad scale when the temple existed because they lived in cities in a huge nation. But it was so if he gets the readers to think about the tabernacle, he sees all that in a compressed way, and it's easier visually to see this notion. There is God, There's the priest trying to get into him, and there's all the people camped around God. They're camped around. God is in their midst. He is among them. And so it was a very important visual sight for the people. Okay, I got to quit in case it splits into two videos. So next week we will talk about 11 and following.